America and his beloved Texas are better places because of his decades-long service. And my life, Mr. Speaker, has been immeasurably enriched by our friendship. And I yield back.
I thank the Majority Leader for his important words. I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pete Sessions.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for leading the discussion tonight in honor of the great member of Congress from the 3rd Congressional District, Sam Johnson. I want to take a few minutes tonight and to not just acknowledge how great Sam Johnson is to the Texas delegation, but really to highlight what he means to this body. Sam Johnson has been a member of this body since 1991. He came in a special election as a result of a hard-fought race in Dallas, Texas, when Congressman Steve Bartlett stepped down. And Sam Johnson came to the United States Congress not just with a background of 29 years of serving in the United States Air Force as being a Top Gun pilot and a man who had served his country in war and at the Hanoi Hilton, but he came here with thoughts and ideas about his home of Texas. Representing Collin County and Dallas County, Texas, is not just a high honor for us to have Sam as our member of Congress at that time and currently, but Sam came to this body with ideas that he felt like that would make our country stronger and better. More than just respect for the flag, respect for the men and women that serve in our military, but really for respect for human life and individuals. He believes that individuals make our country stronger and better, and he has devoted his life. The times we fly back and forth, Sam talks about how important people are in people's dreams, people back home. He remembers not just the stories about individuals, but I think he idolizes hard work and people who commit themselves to the sacrifice for others. Sam is known in this body for several years now as the most admired member of Congress. And he's not the most admired member of Congress because of just being a nice man, and that he is, but really for standing up and talking about the values of this country. The values of this country, what we stand for, and how he wants it to be even better. He and Shirley have for years stood up across Texas and across this country and talked about how important we are if we sacrifice to make others' lives better, if we leave our country better than the way we found it. And so tonight, on behalf of the people of the 32nd Congressional District, which is Dallas, which is right next to Congressman Sam Johnson, I stand up and applaud the life of Sam Johnson, the service to our country, not just the United States Air Force and the American people, but also the man that calls home of Plano, Texas, and the 3rd Congressional Texas, our great friend and colleague, Congressman Sam Johnson. So, Sam, congratulations. Congratulations for not just a job well done, but for the 40 years that you have been back home and what you have done to your life as a result of the service for what you believe was the right thing to do. I thank the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe, for the time, and I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Sessions, points out a little-known fact that after Colonel Sam Johnson got out of that prisoner of war camp, he stayed in the Air Force, served a total of 29 years. He also served in the famed Thunderbirds. He has quite a remarkable Air Force career. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ralph Hall, the senior member of the Texas delegation and the House of Representatives.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague, I do rise as others today for a great American and a very dear friend, Sam Johnson. It's been said over and over again about Operation Homecoming, but that's one of the great days that I remember. And I'm sure it's in Sam's mind and heart, and he appreciates all of us getting to say a few words about him. He served, as you know, for 29 years in the United States Air Force, flying combat missions in both Korea and Vietnam. Captured by enemy forces, go on to spend 7 years captivity as a prisoner of war, including 42 months of solitary confinement. Despite that confinement, Sam never lost his faith in God. He continued to show leadership and courage, helping to teach other prisoners how to survive. Through those 7 years, Sam remained committed to staying strong and helping other fellow soldiers do the same thing. And finally, on February the 12th of 1973, he returned to U.S. soil with other fellow American servicemen as what was known as Operation Homecoming. Once home, he was reunited with his wife, Shirley, who faithfully waited and prayed for Sam's safe return. As a fact about Sam's fighting for our country, he also suffered for our country. This isn't the prime reason his constituents vote for him, though it would be enough, but Sam's completely aware of the rules of the House of Representatives and one of the Speaker's leading whips. When Sam speaks, we listen. Sam and Shirley suffered the loss of a son the last week of February. I hope they felt the love and grief we shared with them and the family. We know that grief is addressed in the Bible. Love spawns grief, and without love, there's little grief. There's much love in the Johnson family, their neighbors and friends. For the approximate 7 years, Sam and the others suffered in Hanoi healthy. A four-letter word was always on their mind: home. In closing, let me just say that Sam continues to fight on the behalf of our veterans and members of the armed services. After 40 years, he continues to serve the American people with the same strength and resolve that he demonstrated in Vietnam. I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to serve with such an exemplary American and to call him a friend. Sam's commitment to his country, faith, and family are values that every American should live by. I ask all my colleagues, of course, to vote aye. Now, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend. I yield back.
Without objection.
Thank the gentleman for his wise words. I now yield to the gentlelady from Fort Worth, Texas, Ms. Kay Granger.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're here tonight to honor our friend and colleague, Sam Johnson, a man of service, a man of faith, and a man of tremendous courage. Sam was released from captivity 40 years ago as part of Operation Homecoming. It was a plan to bring home POWs as part of the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. 591 POWs were brought home as part of that operation, and our dear friend Sam was one of those. Sometimes there are people that do great things, but very few people know about it. People that are only their family or a few close friends. Sam Johnson's life has not been that way because it's been recognized because his achievements are so outstanding, and he's been such a leader. So I think those recognitions deserve to be repeated tonight. 2 Silver Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, the Distinguished Flying Cross, a Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, 4 Air Medals, 3 Outstanding Unit Awards, and the Congressional Medal of Honor Society gave Johnson their highest civilian accolade, the National Patriot Award. Sam, it's such an honor for all of us to serve in this House with you, be a friend of yours, and learn from you. Thank you for all your service. I yield back my time.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Michael Conaway. 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Texas for sitting up this evening to honor our friend and colleague Sam Johnson. Sam's career and exploits have been talked about several times now, and I won't repeat those, but there are a couple of things I would like to highlight. One, not only was he a participant in the he was an Air Force pilot, but he was also a member of the elite Thunderbirds, which is the Air Force's best of the best, that is a demonstration team that goes across this country and around the world representing the Air Force, representing our country. Another thing about Sam is that he had the good fortune of marrying Shirley. If you read Sam's book, Captive Warrior, one of the most poignant parts of that book is Shirley's unwavering, steadfast belief that Sam was still alive. There was a long time there that while Sam was in captivity that we didn't have a proof of life. And Shirley was being told by some very influential folks that Sam had perished. And she just flat out simply refused to believe that throughout all the evidence. And so for a number of years there, she was held that vigil, and it was rewarded, of course, by Sam's coming home some 40 years ago this week. I don't have a lot of heroes on this earth. Sam Johnson's one of them. If I ever get around to writing memoirs, if someone asks me what I'm the most proud of service in this House, one of those things will be to be able to say that I'm among that select and privileged group to have served with Sam Johnson. He is a warrior of the best order, and it is with the most heartfelt emotions that I can muster that I thank him for his service. If I count the years correctly, it's 29 in the Air Force, 10 years in the Texas legislature, and so I'm 22 years here. That's 61 years. I don't know how old Sam is, but that's got to be about half his life anyway. So it is with great pleasure that I thank Sam for his long service to our country, and I yield back. Thank you, Sam.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Now yield to the gentleman from Round Rock, Texas, Judge John Carter.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Sam Johnson's an American hero, and everybody in this House knows that. He's an American hero for all kinds of ways that he has served this country. And many other people talk here are going to talk about those ways, and every one of them are important. But I read Sam's book. It's an awesome book. It makes you cry at points. It makes you struggle. But it also expresses the kind of a man and, quite frankly, the kind of a family Sam Johnson has. Sam was a guy with broken leg, dislocated shoulders, who looked them straight in the eye and spit in their face and told them, take your best shot. And he suffered for it, suffered unmercifully for it. But he never gave in to the enemy. He always stood his ground to his detriment. And it harmed him in so many physical ways. And yet, the thing that makes me always tear up is that if you read the part of the book where Sam steps off that plane when we finally repatriated our prisoners and saluted and said, Colonel Sam Johnson reporting for duty, sir. And Sam reports for duty. You know, people say, who do you want to have your back in a foxhole? But people also say, who do you want to have your back in Congress? And I want Sam Johnson to have my back in Congress. He's a friend. He's one of my best friends in this Congress. I've gotten to know him very well. He and I go to a Christian retreat together almost every year. And that's one of the things you notice from the book. Sam didn't talk about himself. He talked about when they took him out and he thought, this time they're going to shoot me. And he prayed to God that he could stand there and be a man. And they went ready, aim, fire, click. And one more time, they didn't shoot him. And at that time, he thanked God and his Savior because he knew he had witnessed a miracle. Meanwhile, his sweet wife was praying and fighting on the home front because she didn't know, she got very little news about what was going on in Sam's life. But she never gave up because her faith strengthened her. And that's part of the theme of that book that you need to pick up and read. That their faith strengthened them in trials that none of us can ever imagine. Sam Johnson is a hero not just because of what went on in Vietnam and what our enemy did to him. He's a hero because he comes here every day and he fights for the people of his district and for the state and for this country. He's willing to take a risk and step out even now after all the years of service, both legislatively and in the Congress. Sam Johnson is one that's willing to step out and take the shots. I was once asked by 60 Minutes, define what a leader is. And I said, well, I'm just a history guy who reads history. And I always thought in the First World War how hard it would have been to come out of those trenches and charge those machine guns with a bolt-action rifle, and that the officers who climbed out in front and said, let's go, boys, let's go get them, were the heroes. And the guys that stayed in the bottom and said, you go get them, boys, they were not heroes. And a special hero is one who says, I'm going first and I'll take the shots. There's plenty of shots to be had in this chamber, and those are political shots. But I'm proud to say that that same hero that spit in the enemy's face, Sam Johnson, is still willing to stand up and take the shots in Congress. And for that reason, today I honor my good friend Sam Johnson and tell him I want him to keep taking care of my back, because I need it real bad. God bless you, Sam. You're my friend.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, Judge Carter points out something that happened to Sam Johnson during that 7 years that a lot of people don't realize. When he was in that little cell, 3 foot by 9 foot, he was so obstinate, they would bring the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese army, they'd take him out of the cell, they'd beat him up, he'd never break. They'd get so mad at that he wouldn't break, that they'd line him up against a wall. And they would tell him they're going to shoot him. They'd blindfold him, they would get their AK-47s ready, and as Judge Carter mentioned, they'd pull the trigger, click, click, click. And then they would laugh at him. Sam Johnson would say, is that the best you got? Is that the best you got? He didn't take anything from the Vietnamese, even though they tried to do everything they could to break him down. And that's what makes him so remarkable. You may notice, Mr. Speaker, he's sitting back here on our scriptural row. All the Texans sit on the same row. He sits in the middle. One reason we sit back there is because that's the row he picks. So we all sit next to him, and you'll see every day when the House is in session, the Texans were all together sitting around Sam Johnson, and we kind of stick together for a lot of reasons. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, we are here tonight to honor Congressman Sam Johnson. And you know, it's also appropriate to take a moment and send our thoughts and prayers to Congressman Johnson's family during a difficult time that they're going through right now. As we've heard tonight, Congressman Johnson is a decorated war hero, 29 years service in the United States Air Force, 62 combat missions in the Korean War, and 25 missions in Vietnam. He endured almost 7 years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi, with a majority spent in solitary confinement after being captured by the North Vietnamese. Congressman Johnson persevered through this dreadful experience, returned to the United States, and was reunited with his wife and 3 children on February 12, 1973. And this week marks the 40th anniversary of his release, and we celebrate his achievements and his sacrifice for our country. In fact, 10 years ago this week, I gave what was my first speech on the House floor, honoring then Sam Johnson's 30th anniversary of freedom, and at that time his wife Shirley was with us in the gallery. When Sam came home, he undertook a duty to continuously support and protect every man and woman who risked their lives fighting for the United States of America. This was a motivation for his decision to run for office, and it is a true statement to the character and virtues that he gained from service to this country. And you know, thinking about Shirley, every summer she does a fashion show in Frisco, Texas. Sam is my neighbor to the east from the congressional district that I represent. And Shirley does a fashion show, and the proceeds go to provide scholarships for kids in the area. True dedication to community service, and we're also honored to have Sam and Shirley in our lives. Thank you, Congressman Johnson. Thank you for being my friend, my mentor, providing me expertise when I ran for the House and when I arrived in the House, and you continue to provide mentorship to me today. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to place in the record a statement by Congressman Jeb Henserling.
The gentleman's request will be covered by General Lee. The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave.
I now yield to the gentleman from Tyler, Texas, Judge Gomert.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my friend, former judge as well. It is an honor to be here, to be part of this special order to honor our friend Sam Johnson. Sam and Shirley are public servants in every sense of the word. There is 29 years in the Air Force. The United States service was what he was. It's what he did. 7 years in Hanoi Hilton, one of the worst prisons ever concocted in the imagination of sick minds, and 42 months of that in solitary confinement. There are people running around the world saying you can't put people in solitary confinement, but they were not around to help Sam Johnson during that horrible time in Hanoi. This is the 40th anniversary of his release, and America has been better for Sam Johnson living and serving, and Shirley being his partner, even though 7 years they were apart. I know the first day I was sworn in, I was sitting right over here on the aisle talking to another Republican, and Sam came down the aisle. His body still shows the torture and the broken bones that never healed properly, and the bones that grew around nerves that were never able to fix. And when he got even with me, I stood up and shook his hand and said, "Sam, it is such an honor to serve with you in this body." And Sam has always been a man of honesty and integrity, a man whose judgment I could trust. And he said, well, it's an honor serving with you, which was a stretch. But then he said, but don't trust that fella next to you. I found out after that Sam Johnson's advice was always good and always advice that could be well taken. After some of the revelations in the Middle East of a U.S. prison camp, I said, Sam, did you hear about the torture of making people strip down and put panties on their heads? And he had said, yeah. He said, I said, was that ever a choice that you were given? He said, if it had been, I'd be naked wearing panties still today. There was nothing compared to the hell that man was put through in Hanoi. When I found out that in our U.S. prisons, it's open information, we provide not only a Quran that's never been touched by American hands, but also an arrow on the floor pointing the direction that the Islamic prisoner would want to pray, and give them a prayer rug. And I asked Sam, when you were in Hanoi, did you have a prayer rug and a Bible, as that was part of your faith? And he said, no, actually what we had was a tiny little rod that was placed on the floor, our feet in shackles. We would be beat on the back until we dropped, and our knees, my knees would hit that tiny rod. Doesn't sound like much, but when you spend hours or days with your knees and all your weight on a tiny little rod on the floor, it gets pretty unbearable. And that was some of the less tortuous stuff this man went through on our behalf. Part of his service to this country are his children and his grandchildren. And it is with great sadness that I know Sam and Shirley in this country lost Bob Johnson. From Plano High School to Texas A&M, his children and grandchildren. Sam, our hearts are with you. You have sacrificed more than anybody I know on behalf of this country, and it is an honor to serve with you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Tyler, Texas. I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Lamar Smith.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for organizing this special order tonight. And, Mr. Speaker, today's special order is to honor our friend, colleague, and a true American patriot, Congressman Sam Johnson, and his 40th anniversary of freedom. Congressman Johnson has a long history of serving our country. He spent 29 years in the United States Air Force, and flew 87 combat missions during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He was awarded 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Flying Cross, a Bronze Star with Valor, and received many other recognitions. Today we celebrate Operation Homecoming and observe the 40th anniversary of his release from a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. Congressman Sam Johnson was captured and held for 7 years in a POW camp in Vietnam. He spent 42 months in solitary confinement, an unfortunate record. Though tested both physically and mentally, almost beyond comprehension, his unwavering love of God and country remained steadfast. A first-hand account of Congressman Johnson's experience in the Vietnamese POW camp can be found in his riveting and inspiring book, Captive Warriors, which will cause you to weep. His commitment to his country was matched only by his wife Shirley's commitment to him. Friends say she set a seat at the table every night while he was gone with the hope and expectation that he would come home. After his release, Congressman Johnson started a home-building business from the ground up. Then he was elected to the Texas House of Representatives for 7 years, and he has now represented Texas's 3rd congressional district since 1991. It's a professional honor and a personal privilege to serve with Congressman Sam Johnson. Today we thank him for his service to our country and to the American people. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to another aviator, although he wasn't in the Air Force, he was in the Navy. It still counts, but he served our country as a naval aviator before Mr. Pete Olson came to the House of Representatives. Pete Olson of Sugar Land, Texas. Recognize him for his, yield to him as much time as he wishes.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank my friend and fellow Texan, Judge Ted Poe, for hosting this special order celebrating the greatest Texan in Congress, Colonel Sam Johnson, on the 40th anniversary of his return home after 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. We've heard the stories of Sam's lifetime of service to our nation. They are the stuff of legend, the best of the best. Sam was shot down on his 25th mission over Vietnam, captured and imprisoned by the enemy. He was put in a special prison known as Alcatraz, whose 2 years in Alcatraz were described by Sam as, quote, hell on earth, end quote. 20 years after Sam left Alcatraz, I began my training to become a naval aviator. Part of that training included prisoner of war school, also known as SEER school, for survive, evade, resist, and escape. In SEER school, we were locked in a dark box, deprived of sleep, exposed to interrogation techniques depicted in the movie Zero Dark 30. The main lesson I learned in SEER school was because of Sam Johnson, that my duty as a POW was to resist, and to resist, and to resist, and to resist, and to resist, to my breaking point as a human being. And when I hit that point, my duty was to bend a little, give some incomplete or vague information, regroup, and start anew. To resist, to resist, to resist, to resist, and to resist. Because of Sam Johnson's experience, every U.S. military pilot who follows in his footsteps, like me, knows in our hearts that if we're captured, we will never stop resisting our captors, and we will always come home with honor, like Sam did. The heart of Sam Johnson, the Sam Johnson that I know, can be summed up in the first sentence Sam reportedly said to his fellow POWs after he left solitary confinement. Sam said, "Lieutenant Colonel Sam Johnson, reporting for duty, sir." I imagine that our POW in charge responded to Sam like this. "Colonel Johnson, take charge and carry out the plan of the day." Sam has been taking charge and carrying out the plan of the day his whole life. I wasn't there to greet Sam when he came home 40 years ago. So I'll say it to my friend now. Welcome home, Sam. Welcome home. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Sugar Land, Texas, Mr. Olson, for his insightful words. You pointed out, Mr. Olson, that he spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp. During that 4 years, he didn't talk to another American for 4 years. He could tap on the wall to contact them, and codes that they had developed over the numerous years they had all been in confinement. And they tapped out the names of the other prisoners, the 374 other prisoners that had been in the Hanoi Hilton at one time. They all memorized the 11, the Alcatraz gang as they called themselves. They memorized those names because they all expected they were going to escape and get back and be able to tell those families who had come into the camp. So, remarkable story. I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roger Williams.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'm honored to stand here today and say a few words about one of my personal heroes and friends and one of America's greatest patriots, Sam Johnson. This month is cause for celebration as it marks 40 years since nearly 600 American POWs, including Congressman Johnson, stepped foot on American soil after enduring years of captivity in the Vietnam War. Many of us couldn't endure for one day what Sam Johnson endured for 7 years, much less endure it with unbreakable strength, unending faith in God, and constant hope that this incredible man has. His captors knew him as a diehard, one of the few POWs who refused to give in and cooperate with their anti-American propaganda. His fellow American prisoners knew him as a leader, one whose spirit could not be broken, whether he was in leg stocks or solitary confinement for 4 years. And his family knew him as their hero, a man who loved serving his country and was willing to sacrifice his life in defense of freedom. I'm honored to know him as a friend. Through his 29-year career in the Air Force, he earned many distinguished decorations, awards, and merits. But for those who have had the pleasure of sitting at the dinner table with Sam, you know those years were also filled with laughter and antics. After all, he did fly with the legendary Thunderbirds before the FAA existed. Men like Sam Johnson were what have made our military great and our country the greatest force on earth. He has built a remarkable legacy with his lifelong service to America, to the great state of Texas, and most important, to his family and loved ones. Colonel Johnson, thank you for your service to our country and for your example to us all. And I'd like to remind people America doesn't give because it's rich. America's rich because it gives. And it's given to Sam Johnson, and for that we're very grateful. Luke 6:38 says, "A good measure be given to you, pressed down, shaken together, put into your lap, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back." Sam, you gave it all to us, and you deserve every great thing that happens to you. So may God bless you, and may God bless our troops. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I now yield to the gentleman from Lubbock, Texas, Mr. Randy Naugebauer.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and it's indeed an honor and a privilege for me to participate in this recognition of our colleague, but more importantly, my friend, Sam Johnson. You know, when I got to Congress, you get to know people, and particularly because Sam was in the Texas delegation, and, you know, people started, they would say, you know Sam's story, and they would begin to tell me a few things about Sam Johnson. And so some of the things that you're hearing tonight are things you would have never heard from Sam Johnson, because Sam doesn't talk about what he does. He just goes about doing the right thing. In fact, he's got a history of serving this country. When you think about Sam Johnson, you think about service. You know, and a lot of people serve. And Sam has served our military, served in our Texas House, and now in the United States Congress. And not everybody serves with equal sacrifice. And when you think about Sam Johnson's life, you think about sacrifice. How I learned more about Sam was an interesting trip that I took with then Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert. And we flew to Vietnam to be one of the first delegations to have a Speaker of the House be in Vietnam since the end of the Vietnam War. And so I decided on that way, on that trip, that I would read Sam's book. So all the way over there, I read Sam's book. And it was just by fate that I read the last page as we landed in Hanoi. Tears streaming down my eyes as I had been on this journey that Sam takes you through with his book of sacrifice and pain, but also a man that had faith, and it was his faith that he relied on a daily basis, and his commitment to his country and the commitment to those who were with him, and the fortitude that he showed of taking those daily, sometimes beatings, and that's in this quietness of solitude. And as we landed there, and I was thinking about Sam, and thinking then at spending 7 years in those conditions, and then coming back home. But as you read that book, what you also know, there's another hero, and Sam would tell you, he'd be quick to point out, and that was his wife, Shirley, who never gave up hope, never gave up on Sam, because she knew the Sam Johnson that we've been talking about tonight. She knew that Sam wouldn't go down easy. And Sam, we are so proud of you and so glad to serve with you. And one of the memorable points of that trip is just a few months before that, Sam himself had traveled back to Hanoi the first time since he had left. And he had signed the guest book just a few pages over, Sam Johnson, back again, where I spent 7 years of my life. It was an honor for me to sign just a few pages over for a great American hero, but more importantly, for a great friend. God bless you, Sam Johnson, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank the gentleman. Thank the gentleman. I'd ask the Speaker, how much time do I have left?
17 minutes. The gentleman has 17 minutes remaining.
I thank the Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Blake Farenthold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Congressman Poe. You know, I'm honored today to stand up here to honor the bravery and commitment that Congressman Sam Johnson has shown his country. Sam lived through an experience that would bring even the toughest soldier to his knees. He was in the Air Force 29 years and then was a prisoner of war for 7 after his F-4 plane was gunned down in North Vietnam. Now, today, 40 years after he was released from captivity, we celebrate his freedom. You know, he was beaten and tortured and kept in a small cell, yet he refused to give up or disclose any information to the enemy. The sacrifice and peril that Sam went through is on the heart of every young man and woman who commits themselves to serve the armed forces. And you know, Sam and his family just suffered a tragic personal loss. You know, I have notes here. You can read about Sam and his accomplishments and his heroics on the internet, or better yet, buy the book. I want to talk for a minute about my experience in the slightly over 2 years that I've been in this House serving with Sam. You know, there is nobody that has the respect of this Congress the way Sam Johnson does. I don't know a single person on either side of the aisle that doesn't appreciate Sam's service and sacrifice and hold him in the highest esteem. And that's saying something when we're serving in a body that's constantly bickering, that has a 8% approval rating. But if all of us who serve were half the man that Sam Johnson is, we would have a 100% approval rating here in Congress. I'm honored to serve with Sam. I thank him for his service, so that seems just too little for what he has done and given up for this country. But I am proud to call him a friend. God bless you, Sam. God bless Texas, and God bless the USA.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Steve Stock.
Sam, when I got here 18 years ago, I first got here, I was wet under the ears, and I started looking at different people's voting patterns, and I didn't know, which way to go or whatever. And also, I know Sam in private is the way he is publicly. And privately, Sam, you're a hardcore American patriot. And I started learning a lot from you. But reading your history and what you did, I just can't imagine being in that confinement for that period of time. It seems like it would be beyond what anybody could take. Yet time and time again, you stood up, and there was only 11 of you that resisted the torture and resisted the torture of the Vietnamese, which broke every Geneva Convention protocol. And Sam, in this area in which you served and our nation, I understand, I think it was 5 rows across and 5 rows down. So AA would be tap, tap, B would be tap, tap, tap. In other words, they would do the alphabet 5, 5 that way. And they would tap out at night. And that's all the communication they had. And serving with Sam and watching Sam go through his service and his commitment to the American people, I don't know if we actually read all of his medals, but you have, I got to get here, he has 2 Silver Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross, a Bronze Stars with Combat Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, 4 Air Medals, 3 Air Force Outstanding Units, and also awarded for a Prisoner of Medal Award. That's just one individual having all those medals. And he served our nation and our country, continues to serve our nation and country, and I'm honored to serve with Sam. And at this time when he's lost his son, you're in our prayers. God bless you, and thank you for offering the opportunity to say a little bit on behalf of Sam. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I now yield to Mr. Bill Flores from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for organizing this very special evening. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my deepest admiration and respect for Congressman Sam Johnson. Tonight, America has heard many accolades for and compliments dedicated to Sam Johnson, and I'm not going to repeat those in my comments. Rather, I want to say that our country needs more Sam Johnsons during these difficult times. We need more persons like Sam to bravely move and serve in our country's military today. We need more persons like Sam to serve as statesmen. We need more people like Sam who put principle ahead of politics or personal gain. We need more persons like Sam to be knightly gentlemen in an unstable society. We need more persons like Sam who are devoted husbands and loving fathers. Mr. Speaker, America needs more heroes like Sam Johnson. I pray that America continues to produce men and women of strength and perseverance and character like Sam Johnson. God bless Sam, his wife Shirley, and his family. In particular, we remember their son, Bob Johnson, this evening. I'm honored and humbled, and I have to say deeply humbled, to serve with my good friend from Texas, Congressman Sam Johnson. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Mr. Speaker, Sam Johnson is a remarkable individual. The nickname that the North Vietnamese gave him of Die Hard, he's still that way. He's hardcore. He is opinionated, and he can back up everything he says. But that's a good thing. He does represent the best that we have in this country, his military background. We have in the House of Representatives members of Congress, both sides, that have served in our military. All branches, in the reserves, the National Guard. They served in World War II. They served in Korea and Vietnam, like Sam Johnson. They've served in both Iraqi wars, the Afghanistan war, and they're still serving today. We have members who have lost their limbs for this country while on active duty serving this country. And Sam Johnson is among that elite that have represented America, the flag, and our country when our country needed our military. He's married, 3 kids. You now know that one of them died recently, and he has 10 grandkids. He served in the war, the second war, not the Korean War, but the second one, the Vietnamese War. Came back home. Americans didn't treat our war veterans from Vietnam very well. They were treated real bad, in fact. Some of our American troops, when they came back home from serving in Vietnam, they wouldn't wear the uniform because Americans would ridicule them for what the country asked them to do. And America has learned since Vietnam. We treat our warriors a lot better now. We treat them like they ought to be treated when they come back home from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. Our warriors from Vietnam didn't get the appropriate welcome back, and as already mentioned, tonight we welcome back one of them. We welcome back Colonel Sam Johnson, United States Air Force, reporting for duty. After spending 7 years in a prisoner of war camp, 4 years in solitary confinement, as I pointed out, 9 foot by 3 foot for 4 years, 24 hours a day. Leg irons at night, taken out in the daytime and beat. Never broke. Die hard. Never gave in. He was never broken. Remarkable individual, these Americans who serve and wear the uniform. It's a rare breed, but it's the American breed. And that's what makes us free. Those people, those remarkable people who wear the uniform and serve overseas, and serve in prisoner of war camps if necessary. So we thank Sam Johnson. We thank all who have served and are serving today for their service to our great country. But especially tonight, we welcome home Sam Johnson of the United States Air Force. And I yield back the remainder of my time. And that's just the way it is.
Back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent that all members be given 5 days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. I also ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record statement by the Honorable Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas.
The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave.
Thank you. The Congressional Black Caucus is proud to anchor this hour, and I'm pleased to be here with our chair, the Honorable Marcia Fudge, from the 11th Congressional District of Ohio. And I'd like to yield her as much time as she is necessary.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And thank you, as well as Mr. Jeffries, for anchoring these CBC hours. It is wonderful to have new members come to the House floor and do the work that we've been doing for so long. I am so proud of them and appreciative of the work they do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to send a clear message to those who would seek to undermine our constitutional right to vote. You will not win. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. This is not the first time Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act has been challenged, and there is a very good chance that it will not be the last. The Congressional Black Caucus and many others, even a number of members from the other side of the aisle, have continually reauthorized and worked to protect Section 5. In a matter of days, the Supreme Court will review the constitutionality of Section 5. If the Supreme Court does not ultimately decide to protect the uninhibited right to vote for all voters, no matter their race, the Court will not and must not have the last word on this matter. The 15th Amendment provides that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous servitude. Despite the passage of the 15th Amendment and ratification by the states, Congress has been forced to act in order to protect African American voters from violence and intimidation. Prior to the Voting Rights Act, the court's attempts to protect voters proved inadequate. In 1965, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, when vicious dogs and poll taxes were used to block the ballot, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. This law was necessary then, and the last two federal elections have shown without a shadow of a doubt that Section 5 remains essential today. The right to vote is among the most important rights we enjoy as Americans. Because of its importance, because of the power behind the vote, it is the one right most often compromised. And for the same reasons, it is a right that we must do everything in our power to protect. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, and I quote, "So long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself," end quote. As the Supreme Court prepares to hear arguments in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, we must remember the words of Dr. King and the importance of Section 5. Since 1982, approximately 2,400 discriminatory voting changes have been successfully blocked by Section 5 of the pre-clearance process. After the 2010 midterms, 8 of 11 states that were a part of the former Confederacy passed new voting restrictions. These laws require government-issued photo ID to cast a ballot, proof of citizenship to register to vote, many cut back on early voting, and several disenfranchised ex-offenders. These laws are specifically designed to make it more difficult for minorities and other traditionally marginalized eligible voters to participate in the political process. The recent assault on voters was not restricted to the states with a history of voting discrimination. In my home state of Ohio and in many other states and jurisdictions not covered by Section 5, there were attempts to pass restrictive laws. Leading up to the 2012 election, 22 laws and 2 executive actions restricting voting rights were passed in 17 states. 176 restrictive bills were filed in 41 states. The federal government should be doubling down on the Voting Rights Act by expanding and strengthening federal protections. The long lines in Florida and the voting scams in Arizona were no coincidence. Section 5 is as necessary today as it was on the date of its inception in 1965 and should include more states and jurisdictions. And I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fudge. We look forward to your leadership on this and other issues under your steady hand of the Congressional Black Caucus, this 113th Congress. I now yield to the distinguished member from North Carolina, Representative Mr. Butterfield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time, and particularly thank the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus for her leadership in convening this special hour tonight. As many of our colleagues know, before being elected to Congress 8 years ago, I was a trial judge and an appellate judge in my home state of North Carolina. But what many of you may not know is that for some 6 years before becoming a judge, I spent considerable time litigating cases under the Voting Rights Act and presenting comments to the Department of Justice in Section 5 cases. Mr. Speaker, so many people do not understand Section 5. This pre-clearance provision does not apply in every jurisdiction in America. It only applies to selected counties where there was evidence of discriminatory voting practices when the Voting Rights Act was first enacted in 1965. These jurisdictions are required to submit to the Department of Justice any changes in election law or procedure for a determination of whether the change could have a negative impact on the voting strength of minority groups. If the jurisdiction fails in their proof, the change is not allowed. And I will say for the record today that in the early days of Section 5, many jurisdictions ignored their requirement. It has been proven, Mr. Speaker, time and time again in courtrooms across America that racially polarized voting has existed at the ballot box since the 15th Amendment was ratified, and it exists today. My congressional district in North Carolina, though it is improving, continues to have voting based on the race of the candidate. Many white voters choose not to vote for a candidate who is clearly the preferred candidate of the African American community. When this happens, the black community is handicapped, and we call it vote dilution. And so Section 5's preclearance provision simply is a backstop against jurisdictions devising election schemes that will make it more difficult for the African American community to elect a candidate of its choice, taking into consideration the existence of racially polarized voting. Mr. Speaker, I can cite dozens of instances in North Carolina where discriminatory changes were proposed to election systems and the Department of Justice stepped forward and denied the change. Had it not been for Section 5, black electoral success in my congressional district would be considerably less. Many of the cities and counties in my district now have single-member election districts that were ordered by the courts. The courts have required that some of these districts have a majority African-American districts, which now enable the African-American community to elect candidates of their choice. Elimination of Section 5 could enable mischievous jurisdictions to eliminate district elections in favor of at-large elections, where concentrations of black voters would be submerged into at-large systems. Mr. Speaker, the time has not come when we should eliminate the protection of Section 5. The evidence continues to suggest racially polarized voting that discriminates against the African American community. If this protection is struck down, some governing boards at the state and the local level will seize the opportunity to promulgate election rules that disadvantage minority voters, and the only remedy then will be to file an expensive federal lawsuit and prove intentional discrimination in the district court. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge the Supreme Court to carefully look at the legislative history that we have provided and decide to maintain the protection of Section 5. Again, I thank the gentleman from Nevada for his friendship and his leadership, and thank you for working to make this hour happen tonight. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield. We again appreciate your leadership as the Vice Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus and look forward to working under your leadership as well as Chairwoman Fudge. At this time, I now yield to my colleague and friend, the distinguished member from New Jersey, Representative Payne, Jr.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my good friends and colleagues, Congressman Horsford of Nevada and Congressman Jeffries of New York, for anchoring tonight's CBC special orders on the Voting Rights Act. Fair and equal access to the ballot box is an important topic, and one of these that has not been fully resolved. 150 years ago, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but it took another 100 years to pass the Civil Rights Act and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Since then, our country has made progress in achieving justice and equality, but it is no secret this process has been painfully slow and noticeably deficient. The Supreme Court will hear the case this week, Shelby versus Holder, which, if ruled in the favor of Shelby County, Alabama, would take us back 50 years and undo protections granted in the Voting Rights Act. Some argue that we no longer need some of these protections provided in the Voting Rights Act. Some argue that we have achieved equality and justice for all. Some argue that Section 5 is outdated because racism has been eviscerated. It is true we've come a long way and times have changed. But the unfortunate fact is that we have not changed enough. Let's look at the facts. This past November, people across this nation had to wait in line to vote for hours in places such as Miami, Tampa, Richmond, Charlotte, and Raleigh. Sometimes people waited 6, 7, or 8 hours to exercise their fundamental right to vote. In the President's State of the Union address, President Obama had a guest, a woman by the name of Desaline Victor, who waited 6 hours in Florida to vote. She was 102 years old. This is simply unacceptable. And unfortunately, long voting lines have become all too commonplace, particularly in urban and minority-rich areas. So the big question I get asked from my constituents is, why wouldn't we want everyone who is eligible to have the opportunity to vote? The answer is simple. When more Americans vote, they tend to vote for Democrats. Regardless of someone's political persuasions, every eligible American should have the fair opportunity to cast their ballot, whether they be white, black, Asian, Latino, man, woman, gay, straight, Protestant, Catholic, atheist, or agnostic. Because of the simple fact that we are all Americans, and voting is a fundamental right in this country. This is about preserving democracy, and eliminating Section 5 would undermine that right upon which this country was founded. This past year, 37 state legislatures shamelessly passed laws that oftentimes targeted minorities and attempted to limit their access to the ballot. Strict photo ID laws, limitations on early voting, and stringent voter registration laws all had one purpose. It wasn't about reducing fraud. It was about preventing certain populations from voting. It is astonishing, and it could not be more evident, that racism and the effort to suppress the right to vote is alive and well in this nation. Luckily, Section 5 rightly ensured that many of these laws never passed pre-clearance. So it could not be plainer that now is the time to strengthen, not weaken, Section 5, as it still serves as a very real and critical purpose in preserving our democracy and the right to vote for millions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Payne, Jr. We appreciate